close your eyes, if you like. You don't need them for this. You only need to listen. Tonight, we are going back to New Orleans. Not the New Orleans of beads and brass bands and daylight tourists. An older one. A quieter one. The New Orleans of 1918, humid, gaslit at the edges. Still healing from the last outbreak of yellow fever. Still bracing against a war on the other side of the ocean. A city of shotgun houses, with their doors lined up in a row, so that if you stood at the front step and looked straight through, you could see clean out the back, into the yard, into the dark. Picture it slowly, the way your mind pictures things right before sleep. The narrow streets running down toward the river, cobbled in places, dirt in others. The smell of the Mississippi somewhere underneath everything else. Brackish, warm, a little like copper. Balconies of wrought iron, black against whitewashed brick, hung with ferns nobody quite remembers planting. The gas lamps flicker at the corners, and between them lie long stretches of true dark. The kind of dark a city has mostly forgotten how to make anymore. It is into one of those yards. One of those quiet, ordinary streets that our story begins. Let yourself sink into the pillow. Let your shoulders loosen, one at a time, starting with the one closest to your ear, and let the past come find you. New Orleans, in the spring of 1918, was a city trying to hold two truths in its hands at once. On one hand, the war. Young men were leaving for France, in numbers the city had never seen, and every newspaper column carried casualty lists alongside advertisements for hats and shoe polish, as though grief and commerce had learned to sit at the same table without embarrassment. Ration cards for sugar and flour sat in kitchen drawers next to grocery lists. Gold Star flags, the ones families hung in their windows to mark a son lost overseas, had begun to appear here and there, small and square and terrible, among the ordinary curtains of ordinary homes. On the other hand, the city was, as it always had been, alive after dark. Jazz, still a new word, still spelled a dozen different ways in the papers. Sometimes Yaz, sometimes something else entirely, poured out of the honky-tonks along Pavida Street and out of the dance halls uptown. It was a city where you could hear a funeral dirge in the morning and a rag played on the same cornet by evening, and nobody thought it strange, because grief and joy had always lived close together here, sharing walls the way the shotgun houses did. The neighborhoods where our story unfolds were not the grand ones. They were working neighborhoods, Italian grocers, dock workers, streetcar conductors, families who kept their shops on the ground floor and slept in the rooms above them, close enough to hear the register drawer close at night. Doors were often left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but because the heat made locked, shuttered rooms unbearable, and because, in truth, nobody had ever given anyone much reason to lock them. A screen door might be latched. A back gate might be tied shut with a bit of rope. That was usually enough. That was about to change, in a way none of them could have prepared for, in the small hours of a night in May. In a modest house at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, a grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine lay asleep above their shop, the way they had every night for years. Joseph's brothers lived nearby, close enough that when Catherine's brother-in-law, Andrew, stopped by early the next morning, expecting the shop to be opening as it always did, he found the side door standing open in a way that made his stomach turn before his mind had even caught up to why. He went inside. The house was very quiet, quieter, somehow, than an empty house should be. And in the bedroom, he found a scene that would take the rest of his life to stop seeing every time he closed. Joseph and Catherine Maggio had both been struck about the head, not with a knife, not with a gun, but with the blunt, heavy strike of an axe, one that belonged, in fact, to the couple themselves. It had been left in the yard near a cistern, still wet from where someone had apparently tried to rinse it clean. Nearby, someone had used a chisel, the grocer's own chisel, taken from a toolbox in the shop below, to pry a panel out of the back door, cutting a hole just wide enough for a slim arm to reach through and turn the lock from the inside. Take a moment to notice what that means. Whoever did this did not break in with force, in a hurry, in a panic. They worked carefully, patiently. They planned a method that used nothing they had to carry with them. No weapon of their own. No tool that could later be traced back to a hardware store or a name. Everything they needed, they found already waiting inside the house. That, more than anything else about that first crime scene, unsettled the detectives who stood in that quiet bedroom in the grey early light. This was not an act of sudden rage. This was patience wearing the mask of violence. The police arrived to a puzzle with almost no pieces to hold on to. Nothing had been stolen. A small amount of cash sat untouched in a dresser drawer, in plain sight, as if daring anyone to call this robbery. There was no sign of forced entry beyond that single, careful, almost surgical hole cut through the door panel. The work, investigators said quietly to one another, of someone who had done this kind of thing before, or who had rehearsed it many times in their mind, before ever lifting the chisel. And then there was the writing, on the sidewalk outside the house, in ordinary chalk, the kind any child might use for hopscotch. Someone had written a single sentence. Asterisk, Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight. Just like Mrs. Tony. Asterisk, no one in the department could say who Mrs. Tony was. No record turned up matching the name to any case the police could find. No one could explain the message at all. It read like a taunt or a private joke meant for someone who wasn't there to hear it, the kind of thing a person writes when they are not afraid of being caught, because in their own mind they already know they won't be. It was chalk. It would wash away in the next rain. And in a strange way, that impermanence made it worse. A message meant to be read once, by whoever needed to read it, and then to vanish, the way its author apparently intended to. The Maggio murders made the front page of every newspaper in the city, and for a little while that might have been the end of it. A single, terrible, unsolved tragedy, the kind that leaves a scar on a neighborhood but eventually fades into local memory, into the stories grandmothers tell to keep children close to home after dark. New Orleans had certainly seen violence before. It was, after all, a port city, with all the rough edges a port city carries. But 3 months later, it happened again. And this time, the shape of something larger began, very slowly, to come into view. In late June, a young grocer named Louis Bazuma was attacked in his home, along with a woman named Harriet Lowe, who was living with him. Both were struck with a blunt weapon while they slept, in the same quiet hours, in the same kind of modest house, with the same signature left behind, a panel removed from a door, a household tool used and abandoned. Bazuma survived his injuries, though barely, carried to the hospital with wounds that took weeks to heal and left him disoriented for days. In the following weeks, as he recovered, the police turned their attention toward him rather than away from him. His private life had a few irregularities that made suspicious minds suspicious questions about his citizenship. Rumors about his relationship with Harriet Lowe, and for a time, Investigators wondered if perhaps this was not a stranger's crime at all, but something closer to home, dressed up to look like the Maggio case in order to throw them off the scent. Then Harriet Lowe, in her final hours before she died of her wounds, allegedly named Bazuma as her attacker, though her statement was confused, delivered under the fog of a dying woman's pain and fading consciousness, and its reliability would be argued over by historians for a century afterward. Bazuma was arrested and held for trial. He would eventually be acquitted, the case against him falling apart under its own weight. But by then, the shape of something else had already begun to settle over the city. Something that moved through New Orleans on its own schedule, choosing its houses with no visible pattern except one that repeated, quietly, again and again. Modest homes, a side or back door, and always, always, the same weapon, taken from the victim's own homes and left behind afterward like a signature dot by August. A pregnant woman named Mrs. Edward Schneider was struck in her bed while her husband was out for the evening. She survived the attack, badly shaken, and gave birth safely not long after, though the horror of that night stayed folded into her family's history for the rest of her life. The kind of story told in a lowered voice, if it was told at all. Days later, an Italian barber named Joseph Romano was killed in almost identical fashion, struck while sleeping. An axe left behind in the yard, a panel cut from a door with the same patient. Practiced care. By now, the pattern was undeniable, even if its purpose remained completely out of reach. The city's Italian and Italian-American grocers seemed to be targeted with unsettling frequency, which led some, including, for a time, the police themselves, to wonder if this was the work of the mafia, or some kind of extortion racket that had turned suddenly, brutally violent. New Orleans had a long, uneasy history with organized crime among its Sicilian immigrant community, dating back decades to a notorious incident in the 1890s that had left the city's relationship with its own Italian population strained for a generation. It was not, on its face, an unreasonable place for investigators to look first, but the theory never quite held together, no matter how many times detectives tried to force the pieces into place. Some of the victims had no connection to organized crime whatsoever, no history of threats, no unpaid debts, no enemies anyone could name. Some weren't Italian at all, and there was something in the method itself, the careful chiseled hole in the door. The weapon always borrowed from the house itself, never brought in from outside, never taken away afterward, that spoke less of a hired job, carried out for money, and more of something deeply personal, something the attacker needed to do a particular way, for reasons only they understood, reasons that had nothing to do with debts or business or revenge in any ordinary sense. New Orleans began to feel less like a city with an unsolved murder, and more like a city being watched, one house at a time, by something patient enough to wait for exactly the right night. It is worth pausing here, not to rush past the horror, but to sit with what it must have actually felt like to live through it, night after night, without knowing when or whether it would end. Imagine your city, block by block, starting to understand that someone is choosing houses like yours, not mansions, not the wealthy uptown streets with their gated yards, their electric lights, their night watchmen paid to walk the block until dawn. Ordinary homes, shopkeepers' homes, places with a side door that doesn't quite lock right, a window left cracked for the heat. A life lived the same unremarkable way it had always been lived, until suddenly it wasn't safe anymore. Newspapers ran maps showing the locations of each attack. Red marks scattered like a rash across the working-class neighborhoods, spreading a little further with every edition. Families started keeping their axes and hatchets locked away in sheds, in cellars, wherever they could be hidden, reasoning with a logic that was equal parts desperate and sound, that if the killer always used a weapon from inside the house, then perhaps removing the weapon might remove the danger entirely. Hardware stores reported a strange, quiet run on padlocks. Carpenters were hired not to build, but to reinforce thicker door panels, sturdier frames. Small iron bars fitted across windows that had never needed them before. Vigilante patrols began walking certain blocks at night, lanterns swinging, more out of a need to feel like something was being done than out of any real confidence it would help. Gun sales rose sharply. Rumors moved faster than facts ever could. Someone had seen a stranger crouched near a cistern. Someone had heard footsteps on a roof. Someone's dog had barked at nothing for an hour and then gone suddenly, eerily silent. Whether any of it was true almost didn't matter anymore. The fear itself had become a kind of weather the whole city lived under, and still. Into the fall and winter of 1918, the attacks continued. A grocer named Tony Chambre and his wife were struck in their beds in December. In another home with a chiseled door panel and no answers left behind, no fingerprints of any use, no footprints that led anywhere, no witness who had seen so much as a shadow by this point. The city's newspapers had settled on a name for the killer, one that would outlive every theory investigators ever tried and failed to prove. A name that would still be spoken more than a century later by people who would never set foot in Louisiana, the Axeman. Then, for a little while, it went quiet. Winter passed, cold by New Orleans standards, damp and grey along the river. The war in Europe ended in November of that year, and New Orleans, like every other American city, threw itself into a strange, exhausted kind of celebration. Grief for the dead soldiers braided together with relief that the fighting was finally over. Church bells rang for hours. Strangers embraced in the street. Perhaps some allowed themselves to hope the Axeman had gone quiet too. Perhaps whatever had driven him, if it was a him at all. The papers, the police, and the public argued constantly over even that small basic fact had simply run its course, the way storms sometimes blow themselves out over open water. It hadn't. It had only been resting. Before we go further, it's worth slowing down and sitting inside the investigation itself for a moment, not the crimes, but the strange, halting, very human process of trying to catch someone who leaves almost nothing behind. Police work in 1918. New Orleans looked nothing like the forensic dramas of today. There was no database of fingerprints to search, no forensic lab waiting to match fibers or blood types with any real precision. Detectives worked mostly with what they could see, what they could ask, and what they could guess. They brought in bloodhounds on at least one occasion, walking them through a crime scene in the hope that a scent trail might lead somewhere, anywhere useful. It didn't. The trail, if there ever truly was one, dissolved into the ordinary smells of a working-class street, horse manure, coal, smoke, the river itself. They interviewed neighbors for hours, sometimes days, writing down every scrap of memory in careful longhand. A stranger seen loitering near a fence 3 weeks earlier, a delivery boy who'd taken an unusual route, a boarder who'd moved out suddenly without much explanation. Almost none of it led anywhere. Much of it contradicted itself from one interview to the next. the way memory always does when it's being stretched to answer a question it was never built to answer. Asterisk, asterisk, the newspapers, for their part, were not simply reporting the story. They were, in many ways, shaping it, running breathless updates, printing theories from armchair detectives and self-declared psychics alike, occasionally publishing details about the crime scenes that, by any modern standard, should probably have stayed within the police department's own files. It's worth remembering that the very name, the Axeman, wasn't handed down by any official investigation. It was invented in a headline by an editor who understood, correctly, that a name like that would sell copies on a street corner. Once the name existed, the case stopped being simply a series of crimes and became something closer to a serialized story the whole city was reading together, one grim installment at a time. Some theories from that period sound almost quaint now. A few investigators wondered if the killer might be a former patient recently released from one of the state's asylums, someone whose mind had been affected by illness in a way medicine of the time barely had language for. Others wondered about the psychological toll of the war itself, soldiers coming home changed, unable to describe what they'd seen or done overseas, some of them settling uneasily back into the very neighborhoods where the attacks were happening. None of these theories were ever proven. All of them tell us something about a city trying, with the tools it had, to make sense of a violence that refused to make sense on its own terms. In March of 1919, 5 months after the Schomburg attack, a new letter arrived, not chalked on a sidewalk this time, but sent directly to the newspapers, printed in full on the front page, and read by tens of thousands of people over their breakfast tables on an otherwise unremarkable Friday morning. It claimed to be from the Axeman himself. The letter was strange in a way that is hard to fully convey. Second-hand, theatrical, almost gleeful, written with the flourish of someone who clearly, unmistakably enjoyed being read, enjoyed being feared, enjoyed the sound of his own voice, even on paper. The writer claimed to be not a man at all, but a spirit, a fell demon from the hottest hell, as the letter put it, with a kind of purple, overwrought drama that would have been almost comic if it weren't attached to 5 bodies and counting. He mocked the police for their failure to catch him. He mocked the city for its fear. And then, almost as an afterthought, he made his offer. The Axeman, or whoever had written in his name, declared, with what read as genuine delight, an intention to strike again the following Tuesday night at midnight. But the letter offered the city something strange, something almost playful, an escape clause. He announced that on that Tuesday he would pass over any house in New Orleans where a jazz band was playing. If a home had music in it, real, live jazz, playing loud enough to be heard from the street, he claimed he would leave it be, moving on in search of quieter houses instead. It is hard to overstate what happened next. On that Tuesday, New Orleans became, by every account that survives, one of the loudest cities in America. Dance halls that would normally have held a modest crowd were packed to the doors and past them, spilling out onto the sidewalks. Families who had never owned an instrument in their lives borrowed pianos from neighbors, hired musicians off the street corners, invited whole blocks over just to make noise together until dawn. Bands that usually played for parties, for weddings, for ordinary Saturday nights, found themselves hired instead for something closer to an exorcism, paid not for celebration, but for protection. It was equal parts absurd and utterly achingly understandable. A city laughing nervously in the dark, making music because the alternative was silence, and silence that year had come to feel less like peace and more like an invitation. Songwriters even capitalized on the moment almost immediately. A tune called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, subtitled Don't Scare Me Papa, was written, published, and sold as sheet music within that same year, turning terror into something a family could gather around a piano and hum together, half laughing, half not. No one was killed that Tuesday night. Whether that was because of the music, or simple coincidence, or the killer choosing, for reasons of his own, to stay home, no one will ever know for certain. But the letter had done something the axe alone never could. It had made the entire city complicit in its own survival, dancing through its fear rather than simply enduring it, turning dread into something you could tap your foot to, if only for one strange, unforgettable night. The Axeman did not stop with the letter, however. Whatever brief theater the city had managed that Tuesday night, the danger had not actually passed, only paused. The way a held breath eventually has to be let out. In August of 1919, a grocer named Steve Boker was struck in his home and survived. Disoriented and unable to offer investigators any useful account of what had happened to him, the details lost somewhere in the blow itself. In September, a pharmacist named Sarah Lauman was attacked in her bed, her window found open, an axe left carefully on her lawn as though set down rather than dropped, the same eerie, deliberate calm running through the scene as every one before it. And in October, the case took its final, most tragic turn. A grocer named Mike Pepitone was murdered in his bed, struck so many times that the sheer violence of the attack shocked even investigators who, by that point, had seen every prior scene the Axeman had left behind. His wife, sleeping in the next room with their children, heard the commotion, rushed in half asleep and disbelieving, and glimpsed only a shadow, a figure fleeing through the darkness of the house. Gone before she could make out any real detail beyond the shape of a person moving fast, low, and silent. Mike Pepitone would be the Axeman's final confirmed victim. After that night, the attacks simply stopped. Not with an arrest, not with a confession, not with any dramatic final confrontation of the kind that true crime stories usually promise their audience. No arrest was ever made that satisfied the full weight of the evidence. No confession was ever verified by anyone with the authority to close the file. The case, in the strict sense that a case can be closed, was never closed at all. It simply ended, the way a held note simply stops, leaving a silence that somehow feels louder than the sound that came before it. New Orleans did what cities do with wounds that never quite heal into scars. It kept living, and it kept wondering, quietly, for decades. Theories multiplied in the years that followed the last attack, each one taking hold for a while before slowly losing its grip on public imagination. Some believed that Axeman was connected to organized crime after all, and that Mike Pepitone's widow, Esther, may have believed this too. In 1921, nearly 2 years after her husband's murder, she traveled all the way to Los Angeles and shot a man named Joseph Mumford in the street, later claiming to police that he was responsible for her husband's death and for the entire string of attacks across New Orleans. She was convicted of manslaughter for the killing, though the connection between Mumford and the Axeman murders was never conclusively proven by any evidence beyond her own certainty, and it remains, to this day, one theory among several rather than a settled answer that historians universally accept. Others have pointed to the strange, theatrical nature of the jazz letter and wondered whether it was ever truly written by the killer at all, or whether some enterprising journalist, hungry for a story that would sell papers by the thousands, had simply invented it out of whole cloth, a hoax riding on the coattails of a real and terrible string of crimes, timed perfectly to a city already primed for exactly that kind of fear. It would not be the only time in history that genuine violence and calculated showmanship blurred into something almost indistinguishable from one another, each feeding the other's legend. Still others, over the years, have wondered if there wasn't one Axeman at all, but two, or several copycats drawn to a method that had already proven itself, each committing their own crime under a name that had, by 1919, become less a person than an idea, a shape any sufficiently desperate or disturbed person could step into for one terrible night. The chisel-cut door, the borrowed axe, the chalk message, these were details that had appeared in every newspaper in the city, available to anyone who read them closely enough to imitate. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of crimes that capture public imagination. This deeply, a real event becomes a story. The story becomes a template, and somewhere along the way it grows harder and harder to say with confidence where the original ends and the imitation begins. Historians who have spent entire careers on the Axeman case still disagree, politely but firmly, on which attacks even belong on the official list, let alone who might have carried them out. A few have suggested the case may never have had a single author at all, that what New Orleans lived through across those 2 years was less one continuous crime than a kind of contagion, one act of violence inspiring another in a city already primed by fear to see the Axeman's hand in every tragedy that resembled his method. Whether it truly was his or not, what we can say with certainty is smaller and in its own way more haunting. We know the names of the dead. We know the doors that were cut open and the tools that were borrowed and returned bloodied to the yards where they belonged. We know a city sat awake together on one particular Tuesday night, filling every room it could with music, choosing togetherness over silence in the only way it knew how. And we know that whoever or whatever walked those streets in 1918 and 1919 was never made to answer for it in any courtroom, under any name we can say for certain and trust. And so the Axeman of New Orleans remains what he has always been, more than a century later, not a solved mystery, but a shape the city learned, slowly and painfully, to live around. A name attached to a pattern of violence that arrived without warning, moved through ordinary homes on ordinary streets for the better part of 2 years, and then vanished as completely as it came, leaving behind only chalk marks long since washed away by rain. One strange and unforgettable letter that turned an entire city into an orchestra for a single night, and the memory of a Tuesday when fear and music briefly became the same thing. It's a strange thing to end a story without an ending. No trial that answers every question. No verdict that settles the argument for good. No name we can say for certain and mean it all these years later. But maybe that's all right. Tonight, here, with your eyes closed and the lights already low, maybe some stories are less about the answer than about the people who lived inside the question, the grocers who reopened their shops the next morning anyway, hands still shaking as they counted the register, the families who borrowed a neighbor's piano just to have something to hold on to until sunrise, the whole tired, frightened, remarkably resilient city that decided, on one particular Tuesday in the spring of 1919, that it would rather make noise together than sit alone with whatever was coming. New Orleans is still there tonight, just like it was then. The shotgun houses, doors lined up straight from front to back. The long hallways you could once see clean through if you stood at just the right angle in just the right light. Somewhere faintly, if you listen closely enough, there's probably a horn playing even now, low and unhurried, the way it always has been, the way it probably always will be. Let that be the last thing you hear tonight. Not the axe, not the silence that came after it, just the music, drifting out over a warm, sleeping city, keeping the dark at a comfortable, familiar distance, all the way until morning finally comes. Good night.